big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Leese.
Well, hi everybody, it's David Leese here. I'm your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier, and a warm welcome. We're glad that you could join this yet again live discussion on YouTube and X and other social media platforms. We're excited about the topic today. Am I excited? I'm kind of ambivalent, to be quite frank. We're talking about Canada's other train wreck called housing affordability. And so it's a tough one, and we want to really get at solutions. And it's a very important topic that affects you. Everybody in Canada is being impacted. So we'll get to that in a sec. So it is June the 13th, 2024. And on this date, would you believe we can kind of half celebrate the fact that it is Tax Freedom Day? Did you know that? So June the 13th, 2024 represents, according to our friends at the Fraser Institute, Tax Freedom Day. It's when we look at the total tax burden, not just income tax, but taxes at the pump to everything. I mean, it's unbelievable the amount of taxes that you pay directly and indirectly. So if we add all those up, we're at that tipping point now where we finally are paying ourselves and not the tax person. So imagine that. So I think it's an interesting calculation. What do you think? Do you think we should be paying more taxes or less? Well, we'd love to hear from you. So we are in a crisis in Canada in a number of key markets, cities, wonderful cities that are really being destroyed. And this is the whole point, is that public policy matters. Public policy has a huge impact on every part of our life, and housing is no exception. So we've all seen a lot of statistics. It's amazing how little you can buy for $1 million. You remember the old song by what was it called? The Bare Naked Ladies of all things. They sang the song, If I Had $1 Million. Well, it's really amazing how little you can buy in terms of a house in markets like Vancouver and Toronto. And so we've got to look at this seriously and say, this is really impacting everybody. And what should we make of this? So I am very honored to have yet again a friend, senior fellow at Frontier, the great Wendell Cox. Wendell is a world-renowned expert on housing. So a warm welcome to you, Wendell, for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, Wendell, you are quite renowned internationally, and you have not told me this. I have figured this out because I've spoken with so many people internationally about this issue. In fact, I was just speaking at a conference in Vancouver, of all places, in April about the issue of housing affordability, and your name came up several times. So we're really delighted to have you here because you do research with Frontier. You issue many reports, and a big one that you do in Canada was just released by the Frontier Centre. Be sure to look at the website for that report. So I want to begin with a really simple question. What do you mean by housing affordability? How do you define it, Wendell?
Well, what I do is I go back to history and ask, where was housing affordability before our planners got a hold of it and started over-regulating? The 1971 Canadian census asked people how much their house was worth, and it also was the first census that showed median household income. So we have median house values and median household income from 1971. And in fact, I don't know if you've got that first slide yet, but if we could put that up, see that slide basically tells you what has happened only from 2004 to 2022. But my point is, in 1971, the median house price in Toronto was about 3.9. Today, it's 9.3. That's the red line. Now, what that means is, if you look at how much the house costs, it was costing 3.9 times your income in 1971, and it's costing 9.3 times now. You can look at Vancouver, which is the dark green line, and it was down under, it was about 4 in 1971. But notice how little housing affordability had deteriorated. It had deteriorated badly in Vancouver, where it had gone from about 4 to about 5. But the basic point is, when you have a market operating, housing tends to be 3 times or less incomes. And you can see what's going on in Toronto and Vancouver, and there are problems in the other areas as well, but not nearly so much. And the basic point, by the way, is don't think for a moment that Canada is all by itself on this. You go to Australia and New Zealand, and you will find that it is even worse. In Australia and New Zealand, you go to small towns and you find the same problem. You go to Europe, and they're wondering what's wrong. Well, I'll tell you what's wrong. Is the planners have a great idea for making our cities better. They want to densify them. They want to draw lines around them. And, it reminds me of what happened to the egg market. I like eggs. We buy and use a lot of eggs in our household. Well,
Okay.
There was a time where we stopped buying eggs about 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, when the price of eggs got to 4 times what it was just 3 years earlier. Why did that happen? Because there's an avian flu problem in the United States. I don't know if it just hits Canada.
Yes.
And it was killing chickens and hens especially, and it caused the prices to go up. In other words, there was a shortage of affordable eggs. And so all of a sudden, the price of eggs went up. Well, what happens when you draw a line around? If you were to say, basically, we're only going to allow you to buy in BC, you're only going to allow you to buy 50,000 cars in BC next year, you can bet the price would go through the roof. Well, you've done that with housing. For 50 years in the Vancouver area, you have had provincial law that is basically says you shall not build in the agricultural reserve. You stop the city from organically growing, and you force the prices up. And not only did you force prices up, people like Vancouver. Vancouver, to a lot of people, is the best metropolitan area in Canada to live in. And so the demand is there, and the prices keep going up. And so long as you don't get rid of these boundaries that are driving the price up, there isn't anything you're going to be able to do. It's just going to get worse.
Okay, so let's back up for a sec. So that's quite a summation here. But the bottom line is that affordability is kind of a common sense measure here. It's basically, are you saying 2 to 3 times your family income? Like your house needs to be not much more than 2 to 3 times your income. And that makes sense.
That's right. I would say household, because in the modern age, we have households and families. But yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
And by the way, if you go back, we've done research going back to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, Ireland, and the United Kingdom even, and found that in the early 90s, overall, and this didn't include some markets like Vancouver, overall housing was about 3 times incomes. That's where it should be. So
3 times income. And then you're saying government has got involved in select markets, not all of them in Canada, and overregulated the use of land to the point where that's what's driving up this nutty scenario where the inflation on housing is now, you said 9.7 times average family household income in Toronto alone.
Yeah, well, in Vancouver, what is it, 12.0 times.
Yeah. Okay.
But again, you go to Sydney, Australia, is 15 times. So I mean, this is going on anywhere. Essentially, the planners have gotten in there and created these urban growth boundaries or these agricultural reserves. They drive the price of land up. There's hardly any difference. I mean, a small difference between the price of building a house, let's say, in St. John, New Brunswick, or Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Vancouver. Yet the house price differentials are hugely different. Why? Because you are paying for the land. In fact, There's a UBC professor who's well known by the name of Patrick Condon, who basically reminds us it is the dirt you're paying for. That's exactly what you're paying for.
Exactly.
And middle class Canadians can no longer afford to pay for it.
Wow. So that's the punchline. It's the land price that has been created. It's a bubble that's been created by planners in government that have gone overboard at the local level, the provincial level, and they have ruined affordability for housing. So those are the guilty parties. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, for example, what happened in BC I believe the year was 1972, but a lot of people blame the NDP Barnett government, which in 1972.
Dave Barrett, yes.
Barrett,
yes.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
In any event, that was when they imposed the agricultural reserve. It was 50 years ago. You go to Ontario. It was, believe it or not, the Mike Harris administration that began the problem in the early 2000s. And then after that, you had Dalton McGuinty of the Liberals come in and finish it with the places to grow problem. And that's when housing affordability went from the 3.9 area to the 9.3 area. Yeah. And again, in all of Australia, this has happened, in all of New Zealand, and there are major parts of the United States where this has happened as well.
So it's the same story again and again. Government is going overboard on these land regulations. It creates a bubble around the land values. It's just unbelievable. So when we look at this issue, though, can we just highlight the other slides that we have here from the report?
Yeah.
This is a very important report here. So what does this slide mean here?
Well, remember we talked about how what's going on in Toronto is unbelievable. Toronto, of course, is the biggest recipient of your very strong international migration that's occurring in Canada. Most of the immigrants, I think most of the immigrants from outside the country are moving into the Toronto metropolitan area. But what's happening is that in the environment where you can't build anything anymore in Toronto because the regulations are so bad, it's now forcing people to move out to find the housing they want. Because, somebody doesn't move from India looking to live in a high-rise apartment. Most young kids who are forming families are not interested in trying to raise kids on a 40th floor condominium. So the basic point is what's happened is a huge amount of outmigration from the Toronto CMA metropolitan area. Same things happened in Vancouver as well. And so what you see here is a list of the markets nearby Toronto, places like Barrie, Guelph, Kitchener, Waterloo, Peterborough, etc., where this shows what was the median multiple, the median house price divided by the median household income in 2015 versus 2023. And you can see that the house prices relative to incomes have just about doubled everywhere. There's some places where it's not quite that bad, but it's bad enough. So the Toronto problem, which has created such difficulties in the entire metropolitan area. You cannot read the daily papers in Toronto without knowing that every politician in Toronto recognizes the problem. None of them have any idea what's causing it, but that's a different matter. And now the problem is going elsewhere. And so that you see there, I could have shown you another chart that would have shown you what's going on in BC, where similar numbers would be shown as people have moved out of the Vancouver area to Victoria, to Nanaimo, to Courtenay, even to Kamloops. It seems a little strange to me to go all the way to Kamloops, and to Kelowna, a nice place. But what's happened is the prices in all of these places have gone out of control, and they are going to continue to get worse until we deal with the land problem.
Wow. So I'm talking with senior fellow Wendell Cox, an expert regarding housing affordability. He's a par excellence researcher, and we're talking about his recent report that was just tabled by the Frontier Center for Public Policy regarding this vital topic. So, gosh, what do you think? We'd love to hear your questions. Does housing affordability mean to you? So quick question, Wendell. when we look at this whole issue, you're saying it's going to get worse. It's not going to get better. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The problem is the demand. First of all, you have the federal government and others in Canada seeking to have strong international migration. You know, there was the huge increase in migration. I think it was last year. Well, where are these people going to live? I mean,
No, it's crazy.
who can afford these prices?
Yeah.
And you do have new families being formed. The planners, you know, there are all these zoning ideas. You know, the city of Vancouver has passed something that allows, I think, up to 6 units on a single family lot. The Ebby government has imposed things on the municipalities. The same thing has happened in some other places across the country as well. But you know, a family is not looking to live in a garage or an accessory development. And accessory units are fine. Yeah, grandma and grandpa put them in there. That's great. That's wonderful. But raising a family you don't do in a condominium building and you don't do in the backyard. But the planners don't understand this, because the planners, except with respect to themselves, see housing as a commodity. You know, an apartment unit is as good as a detached house. Now, there's nothing wrong with an apartment unit if that's how you want to live. But let me tell you, the polls are very clear that Canadians really do prefer detached houses with yards. There's no question about that.
No, and you know, as proof of that, it's amazing. I met actually just 6 months ago with a person that was helping me. I think they were. It was a hairdresser actually, who was very disturbed about having to live in this small, modest apartment, and they have one child, and now they're in this dilemma. Well, do we even think about a second child? Because there just really is not enough room. Like, this really is hitting people hard, and I really feel for people, because, you know, everyone has a dream of wanting to establish a family, a home, to move forward, but it's like the government is just creating a train wreck. So, in this context, you've gone through eloquently how there's certain markets that are deteriorating, and I know that anecdotally, there's a lot of people in BC, for instance. I believe a poll just came out again last week that confirmed that some 50% of people in BC want to move out of the province. And there's a number of reasons, but the primary variable is affordability. You can't afford to live here. And so, like housing, like, why would the next generation stay in BC or Toronto? I mean, obviously, almost no one can afford to buy a home in those markets. Now, there's a select few, and if you already have a home and you were fortunate enough to get in that window when things were affordable, then you've got it kind of made. But otherwise, you don't have a future here. So we are, I mean, I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but it's true. We're killing the future of the next generation, aren't we, Wendell?
No question about it. And in fact, there's good research on how limited housing, small housing, the inability to buy housing and own housing has a terribly bad influence on birth rates and total fertility rates. You have a real bad problem in Canada. We have one that's almost as bad in the United States. Already, East Asians have already gone through something much worse. I mean, at this point, you think about Korea. I mean, we all know about the one-child policy in China and the devastation that's created. Korea never had a one-child policy, yet it has a fertility rate lower than China's. Got the lowest in the world. And why? Because people can't afford housing, because they played around with the same kind of regulations that your planners in Toronto and Vancouver have been playing around with for between 20 and 50 years at this point.
Gosh, so we have met the enemy, and it is us, to paraphrase Shakespeare or some other brilliant writer. But it is also very frustrating when it comes to regulations. And I, you know, have had some experience in development, and I mean, it is incredible how long it takes to develop housing in a number of these markets. Like, I know in the Vancouver area, I have friends who've taken 12, 15 years. to bring land on stream. So why would anyone rationally invest in those communities in terms of a business? I mean, it's really ridiculous. So when it comes to then these issues for people trying to create a life for themselves, then obviously people are going to make rational decisions and move to other provinces. So I think your report speaks to that, does it not, Wendell? In the next
Yes, I
slide?
think we have a chart on that as well. Let me, if you don't mind, give you a brief geographical history lesson. Canada, Statistics Canada breaks the country into sort of three classes of population centers. A population center is an area of continuous development. So, for example, in the Vancouver area, that would go from like North Vancouver out to almost to Mission, and down to White Rock, complete, where there's urbanization. That's a population center. You have about 1,000 population centers in Canada, ranging in size from 5.7 million in Toronto to 1,000 in St. Andrews, Manitoba. Well, the basic point is the largest group of these are called census metropolitan areas. They include Vancouver, they include Victoria, and Toronto, etc. In the last 5 years, a net 252,000 people have moved out of these places and moved elsewhere in the country. The second group of population centers is what the Stats Canada calls census agglomerations. These are communities of from 10,000 people to 50,000 or to 100,000 people. 125,000 of the people that moved out of the metropolitan areas moved to these smaller communities. But the amazing thing is that 127,000 of these people moved to places that are even smaller, places that aren't even census agglomerations, places in some cases that don't even have any urbanization at all. And by the way, that's exactly the same thing that's going on in the United States at this point. For example, in just the last 3 years, we've had a net movement of 6 million people from more dense surroundings to less dense surroundings in the United States. Now, that's not many compared to 300 million, but it is a big trend. So the basic
So this graph,
is,
just to be clear, this graph shows in Canada, if I'm
that's
reading
right.
it,
This is
understanding
Canada.
you, shows the wave of people moving out of these big, expensive, unaffordable cities, and they're trying to find a future in smaller communities. Is that it?
And that's right. And this is a big change. You look at the history of Canada over the last 70 years, you find almost no growth outside the metropolitan areas and the census agglomerations. That the areas outside the metropolitan areas and the census agglomeration should be growing is absolutely stunning. And as I say, it's happening elsewhere in the world as well.
So
For
what are the
same
provinces that are growing in a nutshell, Wendell? Who is gaining people then? Is it New Brunswick and others like that?
Well, now this is net domestic migration. This is people who are crossing provincial boundaries. Actually, they're crossing provincial boundaries. And what's happening is Ontario is losing big in terms of the census metropolitan areas that are gaining migrants. Calgary and Edmonton are doing well. Edmonton probably has the best regulation of any of the major metropolitan areas. However, I am very concerned because the planners in those two places, they believe in the same false doctrine that planners in Toronto and Vancouver believe in. They just haven't been able to get away with it. The point is that just before the big housing bust in 2009, housing affordability got way out of control, especially in Calgary. And I'm concerned that it could return because right now we have a lot of people moving to to Calgary and Edmonton. But the amazing thing is, think about New Brunswick growing at this point. When is the last time New Brunswick grew? Think about Nova Scotia growing. Nova Scotia hasn't been setting the world on fire. And the basic point is people are moving from Ontario to New Brunswick and to Nova Scotia. And I'm sure they're moving also to Prince Edward Island. They just don't count. The numbers aren't that large. And you know what? Atlantic Canada, St. John, Moncton, Halifax, these are not bad places to live. They're
Oh,
pretty places.
wonderful places. Yeah. They
And,
just got to make sure that they protect their affordability by
and yeah, that's the
opening up the
game at the
land.
moment.
Yeah.
Right now, we need to stop the spread of this cancer. It is a cancer. It is destroying lives.
Wait a sec. What do you mean by cancer? Be clear, Wendell.
Well,
What do you mean by
I'm
cancer?
telling you that this cancer of urban planning that creates urban growth boundaries and won't let cities expand naturally, forces up
Okay.
prices. The most important element of the cost of living is housing. And that must not be allowed to go on, because if you could find yourself in a place pretty quickly where maybe New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and PEI and Newfoundland are not affordable anymore.
Okay.
And where do you go? And at least at this point, there are places you can go. And by the way, the prairies are doing well as well. I mean, Regina, Saskatoon, Winnipeg have relatively affordable prices, certainly better than the what we call impossibly unaffordable markets of Vancouver and Toronto. And the eastern townships of Quebec, beyond Montreal, they do pretty well as well.
Okay. So what do you think, audience? Do you agree with Wendell Cox here in terms of analysis that this is a cancerous, terrible way of thinking, and that we are creating these messes because these planners, so many others, are creating these false boundaries around urban areas and really creating this mess? They're ruining people's lives, to be very blunt. So I want to just back up a bit here. You mean to say, Wendell, that the fault of this is not foreign buyers? What about them? Or what about the fact that we do need agricultural land, and that, we disagree with you because we need to preserve every spot of agricultural land? You're going overboard. And that's why in BC, as an example, they introduced the agricultural land reserve to preserve that farmland, or around the Toronto area, we want to preserve those green belts. I mean, gosh, we're going to have a food scarcity issue. I can see the university people all up in arms reacting to your thesis here that no, we need to open up the land.
Well, Stanford economist Thomas Sowell has pointed out that he loves to say there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And let me tell you about the trade-offs with respect to urban growth boundaries, agricultural preserves, and the preservation of agricultural land. First of all, probably you haven't heard that the amount of agricultural land in Canada has been reduced by 80,000 square kilometers in the last 70 years. Now, everybody will say, oh, that's because the cities have spread. No. If you take every square kilometer of urban land that has been developed since John Cabot landed, it is only 18,000 square miles or square kilometers. So the basic point is the urbanization of Canada is very, very small. There's plenty of room to allow cities to grow without losing any, compromising your ability to grow crops and grow livestock. And Canada has been a very productive agricultural producer. And this whole idea that we're going to preserve agricultural land, therefore we're going to force people to live in these very dense cities where they can't afford houses, where they have to live in small spaces, where they're more inclined or more inclined to get diseases from one another. No. The planners are very much opposed to what they like to call urban sprawl. Urban sprawl is when a city that's growing grows, it adds space. The point is that now I forgot what I was saying. The basic point is that
Well, I think
there
we were
is
going on
no.
the track
The
if I
problem
made
comes
that.
down to the trade-off between expanding cities or urban sprawl and poverty. Because when someone has to go and wait 10 years for an affordable house, because the local affordable housing wait list is 10 years long, they're in poverty. If you're having to live in subsidized housing, you are in poverty. If you can't afford the housing you want. And so what I'm saying basically is this is a question of urban expansion versus poverty. And if you're in favor of poverty, then by all means support urban growth boundaries and agricultural preserves. But if I hear a politician who will not allow the city to expand to accommodate new people at prices they can afford so they can live as well as you and I do, they aren't serious. And this is a real problem.
Well, it sounds like a very logical argument that there is a dilemma of trade-offs in public policy choices. And I think what you're doing, Wendell, is you're challenging us to realize that all these restrictions on land has very, very real impacts on poverty, the poverty rates. And in fact, I just recall a release, I think it was yesterday, from the Federal Department of Social Development that just said that inflation now alone has moved 0.5 million new Canadians into the poverty level. You know, like this is the same issue, is that expensive housing is another form of inflation. So this is destroying our standard of living. I do have a question from the audience, and it has to do with immigration.
Yes.
Is immigration undermining housing affordability?
Well, let me answer it this way. In an environment where you had wise public policy, and by the way, I'm not saying that Canada's public policy on housing is less wise than anywhere else. I can take you to California and other places in the United States and Australia and show you the same stupid policies that have done the same things in those countries as that has been done in Canada. But if policy, if you were to allow the market to operate, let the market determine prices, not the rationing by bureaucrats to determine prices, there'd be no problem. You could have immigration and large amounts of immigrations. It's wrong to blame immigrants for this. At the same time, unless you do this, unless you're willing to allow cities to expand and you're willing to allow the housing market to develop at prices created by the market, unless you're willing to do that, you probably need to limit how much immigration you have, because people can't find you make the problem even worse. But it is not the immigrants' fault. It is the public policy's fault. It is the fault of public officials and bureaucrats.
But in all fairness, immigration, record amounts of immigration, approaching 2 million now when you include all the numbers. I mean, this has never, ever been seen in Canadian history, this level. This is flooding the zone with people that we don't have a place for them. I mean,
yeah, and I apologize.
Worse,
I'm not enough. I'm not adept enough on my Canadian politics to know the ins and outs of immigration as an issue. But yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, there is a point at which you really do create problems. And obviously, when you don't have room for people like you don't have now, you've got a problem, a real big problem.
It does. So I did want to ask a clarification. What is the difference between housing affordability and affordable housing?
Well, housing affordability is just how affordable are houses. The prices in Vancouver are worse than Toronto, and that's worse than Montreal and so on. But these are prices that are established by the market. That's housing affordability. Affordable housing is subsidized housing. So, and you know, a number of countries, I can't remember what the rules are in Canada, but a number of countries basically say you are eligible for affordable housing if your housing expenditures are more than 30% of your gross income. And you know, regrettably, in Canada, you know, every 3 months the Royal Bank of Canada, RBC, shows you how much of your income you need in the largest metropolitan areas of Canada to afford the median priced house. And you can't find any of not even in Calgary and Edmonton do you find 30%. They're all over that. So that's the big problem. And you have this situation where you can't even take care of the people that you say you're going to take care of. We got the same thing in the United States. We passed a law in the 30s that said if you have to spend more than 30%, you're eligible for affordable housing. Well, we've never provided enough of affordable housing for the people. So anyway, everybody's got that same problem.
So my next question then is, as we see government really in effect create this train wreck of housing affordability in different markets, there's a lot of voices saying, well, that's just the fact that the private sector can't produce these houses, and that means the government needs to build all these houses. The solution then is to, like the Soviet Union, build those houses. And that's the problem. We need to have affordable housing built by the government. Is that the solution, Wendell? Quickly.
No, absolutely not. First of all, if you had government do it, they couldn't do it anywhere near the price of the market because there's no competition. That's the problem with government. And I don't have good examples out of Canada, but I can tell you at this point, to build a say a 2,000 square foot house in California at this point, forget the land. The house is not going to be terribly expensive, maybe $300,000, $400,000. To build a 1,500 square foot affordable house, you're talking at over $1 million when government's involved. Government does not have the ability to deliver these things. The basic problem, though, that's been created in Canada and in California and other places is that they have so distorted the market that the market is incapable of supplying housing that the people can afford. And that's a government problem.
So, this is really a critical issue. We'd love to hear your questions. Keep them coming. Another question I have here is how does, if we build a society based on renters versus homeowners, how does that impact our culture?
Well, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that, but there are great advantages that researchers have found with respect to home ownership. People care, first of all, about their property. I can tell you, I treat my car an awful lot better than I treat a rental car. And I don't know if other people are like that, but I mean, how much money is a renter willing to put into the house to make it better? Well,
right.
Nothing, because that's not their house. So ownership is very important. And there have been studies that have shown generally that the environment is better, but I'm not real up on what are those studies. What they basically say, except people care about their own money more than they care about other people's money.
But I think that those are all very good points, and I mean I know there's been a lot of good research as well when it comes to culture. Is that when you enable people to grow up, so to speak, to get their educational credential, get their career started, to marry, to create family. That's all part of becoming a healthy, high-functioning adult, a contributing citizen to society. So if you kind of undermine housing affordability, you really, my take on it is that I think the research shows us, you're undermining every aspect of your lives and creating high-functioning, healthy citizenship, really. I think that would be another way to see it, perhaps.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
So when we look at some interesting facts I did come across, I believe it came out last month, there's a OECD ranking that ranks Canada 34th out of 35 countries in terms of building permit approval speed. In fact, the permit approval is 3 times faster in the United States, Wendell. And the only country on this OECD scale, apparently, that is slower than Canada for permit approvals. And I know this is a very interesting thing to measure, but it's fascinating that the OEC did this, is a country called Slovakia, of all things. Nothing against them. But is the whole issue of red tape and building permit approval, is that doesn't help our situation of housing affordability either, does it, Wendell?
No, not at all. I mean, when you have a slow permitting process, that means that these investors that are wanting to build and make a profit, they've got to buy the land. They're going to be paying interest for a period of time. No, that is a very big issue. And I know that there's a lot of frustration in the Toronto area, especially that in addition to the problems the Greenbelt creates, in some of the municipalities, there are serious delays. But by the way, I do want to say one thing about municipalities too, because there's a real big misunderstanding across Canada about where the problem is with respect to housing for affordability. It is not at the city of Vancouver or the city of Burnaby or the city of Mission. It is at the Vancouver, at Metro Vancouver, which is the organization which the province has established to handle land use regulation. There isn't a thing the city of Vancouver can do to create land on which to build. Same thing in Toronto. In Toronto, it is the province essentially. So the land use regulation is handled by the province, not by the municipalities. So when I hear people talking about we have to deal with municipal zoning, these are obviously people that don't understand how things work.
Okay, so, but just to nuance this a little bit, you're saying the primary factor has to do with opening up land. Let's get
That's
the
right.
land on stream, right?
That's
and
right.
Then there's all these other contributing factors that are slowing down, decreasing the supply of land, of housing. Pardon me. And so in this context, we have, if you don't have the land available, and you have slow regulations, and then on top of that, you have record amounts of immigration, and you have an inability to get that housing supply. I mean, it all adds up, doesn't it?
Indeed. It is a real problem, and it's a problem we're facing in the States and in Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand. It really is an overall overarching problem.
So I did want to just make if you could ask, I want to ask this a little bit about the origins of this way of thinking. And I know, Wendell, in the past you've spoken about this, but could you briefly reflect on how almost the schooling of the philosophy of planners has changed over the years? I mean, I think it comes from, what is it, the Town and Country Act out of the UK post-World War II, isn't it? Like this way of thinking has kind of been like a virus in terms of how people in decision-making thinks. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, and by the way, the movement had nothing but the best intentions, especially it really started early in the 20th century, but really took off under the Attlee government in Great Britain after World War II. And the idea, I mean, London was terribly overcrowded. It had huge poverty on the east side and all that kind of thing. And other of the industrial cities were also pretty bad. So the planners wanted to make better places for people to live. And they built these new towns and all that. But they built this green belt, because they just thought that was necessary. What they didn't understand was the economics. They never have understood the economics, probably. And so they started doing these green belts around the cities of the United Kingdom. An interesting point is that Sir Peter Hall, who was one of the most famous British planners, said 25 years after the Town and Country Planning Act was passed in 1947, he said the principal failure of it was its inability to control the price of land. Yet have the planners recognized the problem? No, they haven't. I mean, I hate to tell you, I saw an article in the Toronto Star yesterday about how California planners are preparing work for Ontario planners to help them replicate the success they've had in California. And I looked at it
Oh
and I'm
my.
thinking, my God in heaven, please don't read
Terrible.
this stuff. It's even worse than you're doing.
Right.
It's unbelievable. And there is not, I mean, I obviously am only criticizing people that believe this way. But the basic point is, if on balance, the planning community cared about about housing affordability, we wouldn't be in this place. But housing affordability is one not even understood for the most part. Usually, I mean, I hear all sorts of complaints to using price to income ratios to compare housing affordability. A lot of these programs have special provisions that require a review every 10 years to make sure there's enough land. Now, by the way, the house prices should indicate to them that there isn't enough land now. But they don't do it. I mean, and this is a big problem. We need planners who believe in housing affordability. And I'm willing to give them seminars on what housing affordability is, because obviously they don't understand what it is.
Indeed. And so it is interesting. And we have had, you know better than I do, Wendell, meetings with senior officials from Singapore, an incredible country, an incredible nation that is very intriguing as an example, because you have worked with them much more closely than I certainly have. But they drive towards the results of housing affordability. That's what they're driving to.
Right.
So they are all hands on deck. Correct me if I'm wrong, but as a national effort to try to increase the supply of housing so it's affordable. And Singapore has a much higher standard of living than Canada, even though they come out of a context that was a disaster after World War II. Very impoverished country with really virtually no resources. And yet their standard of living is much higher than Singapore. And I'm not saying that everything there is apples to apples. But what I am saying is, gosh, we really need to learn from jurisdictions such as Singapore, don't we?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure that, I mean, first of all, yes, what we need to learn from Singapore is to focus on objectives. Lee Kuan Yew, who was the premier of Singapore for 40 years, I think, or whatever, it was a long time. And his people basically decided that they had to create a property owning society. And they did it. They focused on housing and they focused on housing affordability. A very small country. I mean, the whole land area of Singapore is about the same size, I think, of the city of Toronto. Maybe it's as much as twice. I mean, it's very small.
Yes, it is.
But they have accomplished this, and that's what we need to emulate. They basically control a very large part of the market and have been very successful about it.
And they work with the private sector to do it. So
yeah, the private sector builds this stuff.
So I do have a question. We've heard a lot about changes by some governments to increase density and to shorten public consultations to increase housing. Is that going to work? Is that going to make any difference, Wendell? Is the question.
Well, I'm not sure. I don't know what the issue is with respect to public consultations, but increasing density is not going to do the job. Anywhere you look, if you have higher density, you have worse housing affordability. Think about downtown Toronto.
So can you repeat that, Wendell?
If you have higher density, chances are you have worse housing affordability. In the United States, where we have an annual survey of about 3.6, 3.7 million people called the American Community Survey, you go into that data and you look at the house price divided by the household income, and you rank it by density, you find that density increases price of housing relative to incomes. It is an absolute lie that dense housing is less expensive. I realize theoretically, if you talk to some planners who like to say this, who do not understand economics, they'll say that. They're absolutely wrong.
All right, there you have it. So I'm going to use some Latin here, and I'm going to use the phrase "qui bono." Who benefits from this train wreck? I'm flipping the question here, but is
Well,
there
it's a shame because the beneficiaries are people that had no interest in benefiting. If you happen to live in the Vancouver area, for example, and back in 1980, you bought the median priced house for $40,000, and now it's worth $1.5 million. That's not your
wow?
fault. I don't think you were down there. You weren't across at Parliament House in Victoria, trying to get people to do things to raise the
Of
price of
course.
your house. You have been a recipient of bad policy. You've gained, but it isn't your fault, and that's a real problem. I think there really haven't been any winners. I mean, there have been winners. The incumbents have certainly been winners, and younger generations have been losers. But we are not in a position where we need to be blaming these people because they didn't do it, and that's a problem. It's who gained. I mean, it's really hard to say.
So that is a kind of a humbling statement that, yeah, a number of us have been beneficiaries of really bad public policy. But we all kind of lose in this situation because cities, and I think you've helped teach me this, Wendell, and others like Alain Berthaud, a planner from France, that cities are not just simply places to live. They are labor markets where employees go to find a job, employers find employees, and therefore the issue of housing affordability is critical as people live in that area, and as well as transportation infrastructure, particularly roads, so that people don't commute much more than an hour every day. So all of this
An hour every
increased
day, to and from, half
to
hour
and
each
from.
direction.
Yes, sorry, I stand corrected. So a half an hour each way. I mean, it just shows that we are creating dysfunctional cities that are not working because no one is in their right mind is going to move to Vancouver unless you get paid an incredibly high wage because you can't afford to live here, right?
Right.
And so as an employer, you can't recruit people unless they're from that region already. But who wants to move around in that region because they don't invest in the roads here? I mean, it's very limited. So it's the gridlock is profound. So
That's right.
this is undermining our productivity, I think, as a country when these large cities are no longer working. In fact, our deputy governor of the Bank of Canada just last month said this is an emergency moment. She used the metaphor, this is a break the glass moment when it comes to declining productivity. In fact, just yesterday, I think an RBC report just came out that said our economy is 3% down per capita since from 2019. I mean, these are really, really bad economic figures that show a decline in our standard of living. And it's all interrelated to the story of a housing unaffordability, isn't it, Wendell?
It is. There's research at University of California by a couple of well-regarded economists that basically says the GDP per capita in the United States is 36% below what it would have been if we hadn't had all of this regulation. I mean, there are studies in the UK. There's no question that this over-regulation of housing has caused an awful lot of problems.
What a challenge to get out of this. So when we talk about solutions, how do we get out of this? It's almost like we have a multi-layered issue. We've got a virus of dysfunctional thinking on policy. We've got this set of elites, academics, and people, and elected officials, government bureaucrats that are kind of like they are the good and the great and they know better and they can run everybody's lives and you're going to live and enjoy living in a high density shoebox of a condominium up in the sky. How do we ground this discussion so that people actually understand that as much as you want to increase density, as much as you keep throwing on more regulation, it's not going to change anything in terms of housing affordability. It's going to continue to get worse as long as you don't deal with the issue of land use.
That's
How do
right.
we deal with this?
Well, a couple of things. One is it is real important to make sure those places that still have policies that aren't terrible, those are places like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, and
Yes.
Newfoundland. It's and Eastern Quebec. It is very important to try to make sure these places don't adopt the kinds of policies that have ruined Vancouver and Toronto.
Okay.
And by the way,
Stop the
Montreal,
virus.
yeah, that's right. And by the way, I mean, I've been not talking much about Montreal, but Montreal's on the same train. They're just a few cars behind Vancouver and Toronto at this point. Another thing, and I'm pleased that Governor Lombardo of Nevada has recently asked the president to release federal land on the outskirts of Las Vegas so that new housing can be built and deal with their housing affordability crisis. The Crown owns all sorts of land. I don't know where all of the Crown land is, but where there is the possibility of allowing Crown land to be developed by private developers at low cost. And so what if people drive a little bit further? The fact is, people have for decades proven that they prefer driving until they qualify to living in places they don't want to live in.
Okay. So stay tuned on that one. I just think this is all, as you think about it, more and more interrelated with a way of thinking around public policy.
No question.
That disempowers people from owning land. And if you look around the world, you see all kinds of people waking up and saying, we're not going to put up with this anymore because you are the problem. These decision makers don't get it. And if you look to Europe, where Europe is on fire, whenever you've got farmers protesting in every country in Europe, doesn't that tell you something? That people don't think the status quo is working? This whole kind of intertwined agenda of trying to control people left and right, creating increased costs, decreasing your standard of living is not working. So isn't that part of the solution, is that citizens need to recognize what's going on and how this is harming them, and it doesn't give their kids a future of hope? They need to speak up.
That's right. No question about it.
All right, so speak up. Let's free up the land. Free Willy is the movie that comes to mind when it comes to this issue. I know that's not the best analogy, but I don't know what else to say. I mean, we are being hemmed in terms of our lives, and it's almost like this has been like a slow boil over decades, and now the chickens are coming home to roost. So this is the whole thing. I do have one other question here, Wendell. No one's forcing people to live. Pardon me, I just had it communicated here. No one's forcing people to live in Toronto or Vancouver. Why wouldn't they go where it's cheaper? Well, isn't that exactly what's happening, Wendell?
That's exactly what's happening. That's exactly what's happening. Yep. And by the way, it's going to get worse. I mean, you think of California. No place in North America, including Canada, has added so many people since World War II as California has. And if you look at what's happened with respect to net domestic migration in the last 25 years in California, it is down 3 million people. California is now losing population. California, the Golden State, is a place of gold no longer.
And in Canada, we have the migration of people across from province to province speaks volumes of where people want to thrive now, because
we have not seen we've not seen migration to the Atlantic provinces in decades. We are now seeing it.
All right. Well, Wendell Cox, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us, including the audience, and I want to thank the audience as well for this discussion, for joining this conversation, this vital discussion. And thank you so much for your hard work and research and for joining us today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So that brings an end to our conversation about housing affordability. I hope that it gives you, pause and greater insight into a very important topic. And I urge you to share this conversation with decision makers you may know. Challenge them that we need to start thinking differently because the status quo is not serving Canadians. That is for sure. I also wanted to highlight two other points that I think may interest you. One is that there's a incredible documentary about understanding how COVID-19 was managed. It's an incredible documentary. It's called COVID Collateral. And the premiere in Calgary is happening on Wednesday, June the 26th. Be sure to look at the Frontier website or look up the documentary website, COVID Collateral. I think you'll find that very interesting. And I also wanted to highlight my last announcement, and that has to do with an exciting conference where citizens are coming together. It's called Manitoba Together. It's going to be happening in Beauséjour, in just outside of Winnipeg, on June the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. Be sure to look that up as well if you're in that area. I know there's people coming across the country for that conference, and I think if you care about our country, that certainly may be of interest to you. So that brings an end to our conversation today. I'm so glad you could all join us for this conversation. And until next Thursday, have a great week.